The pages that speak of Katsuhiro's first decades are few, and they are worn by hands that did not believe they were guarding anything of consequence. In the ledgers of Hokkaido Hive's agricultural districts, his name appears in tidy columns beside grain quotas, soil nutrient audits, and the measured tonnage of barley and millet rendered to the administratum. The ink is uniform, the script precise. Nothing in those columns foretells a life that would be pressed into the crucible of the siege of Terra. Hokkaido itself lay on the northern arc of the Pan-Pacific reaches, a fortress hive raised over centuries atop strata of older settlements, its spirework clad in composite plasteel and dusted seasonally by volcanic ash from distant half-dormant peaks. Beneath its cathedral districts, the agriculture levels stretched outward in terraced fields beneath transparent domes, where pale daylight filtered through adamantium ribs into a sea of chlorophyll. Katsuhiro's vocation as an enumerator meant moving among those terraces with his slate and stylus, marking each row, recording growth cycles, cross-checking yields against shipment schedules bound for the orbital elevators. These were years lived by the ticking of the hive's chronometers, not by the march of regiments or the rumble of orbital war. The administratum's weight was constant: taxation schedules, census cycles, devotional compliance reviews, but it was impersonal, a distant machinery. Katsuhiro's days began with incense at the shrine of the harvest saints, continued through the monotony of field audits, and ended in the communal canteens where other mid-level servitors of the agri-sector took their evening ration. The great wars of the Imperium seemed as remote as the cold constellations beyond the void-shielded sky. Yet beneath this veneer of stasis, Terra was never still. Rumors moved along the transport lines from port to hive, whispered of void battles far beyond the solar gate, of loyal fleets shattered and renegade legions closing the void's great arteries. In the taverns of the lower Habs, where off-duty freight crews gathered, the stories grew darker. Entire planets burned, oaths broken by warriors once sworn to the throne. Such tales did not alter the harvest quotas or the meticulous calculations in Katsuhiro's daily tallies, but they left a residue in the air, a faint awareness that the world's quiet was not permanent. It was in these final months before the siege that the administratum's orders shifted from statistical precision to martial conscription. The grain harvests were diverted to emergency reserves. Agricultural auditors were called into census halls and emerged with service assignments stamped in red ink. The Kushtun Naganda regiment, formed hastily from the Pan-Pacific hives, absorbed thousands of such conscripts. Among them, Katsuhiro, stripped of his slate and stylus, was given a lasgun whose serial number was still marked in chalk, and a uniform that smelled faintly of moth oil and disuse. The train that carried him from Hokkaido to the Helios Gate ran through a Terran landscape few of its citizens ever saw, over the girdled oceans, past the broken ruins of pre-unity structures, through forests long since regimented into geometric planting grids. Above, the sky was crowded with contrails and orbital defense fire. Even before he saw the walls of the Imperial Palace rising like a continent of their own, Katsuhiro knew his measured, enumerated life had ended. Somewhere in the hive's abandoned counting chambers, the last ledger with his name still lies open, the column unfinished, the ink line cut short. The Kushtun Naganda was not a regiment in the storied sense, with colours born from a dozen campaigns or officers schooled in the war colleges of the segmentum. It was a muster of necessity: hive workers, dock crews, hab labourers, and administratum functionaries herded into companies, each given a number and a weapon, each instructed to hold a line whose geography they barely understood. Bastion 16 lay in the outer ring before the Helios Gate, its ramparts stitched into the wider curtain wall that shielded the southern approaches to the Imperial Palace. From a distance, the bastion was a slab of adamantine and ferrocrete without ornament, a blunt protrusion from the Great Wall whose bulk was said to have been laid in the earliest years of the Emperor's reign. Up close, it was a warren of gun galleries, barracks alcoves, and ammunition vaults, all cut by corridors so narrow 2 men in flak could not pass abreast without their shoulders striking. The air reeked of oil, cordite, and the slow seep of chemical sealants. Katsuhiro's company was billeted in the western wing, within earshot of the curtain wall's gun batteries. Here he met Ms. and Doromek, fellow conscripts from distant hives. In the earliest days, there was a kind of camaraderie, born of shared ignorance and the small rituals of survival, checking charge packs, cleaning field kit, trading rumors from other sectors of the line. That warmth would later curdle into mistrust, but in those first hours, they were only men waiting for the war to find them. The first assaults came not from the traitor legions, but from the formless mass of the War Master's mortal hosts. Beastmen roared in the killing zones beyond the Bastion's field of fire, their charges broken against the crossfire of laser guns and emplaced bolters. Mutants with twisted limbs and bone spur armor surged forward, some flinging crude explosives, others simply clawing at the walls until they were torn apart by disciplined volleys. The traitor army followed, men once clad in the same flak and steel, now daubed in the sigils of the warp, their discipline warped into a feverish, murderous zeal. Katsuhiro fired until his vision tunneled, last discharge glaring through the sights, the air around him hot with vented charge gas. Hours blurred into one another, the bodies below the wall piling into obscene barricades. Every lull was brief. Every new attack came with some new horror. Vox screamers to disorient the defenders, daubed standards bearing the mark of the eye, hulking silhouettes whose armor bore the green rot of Nurgle's blight. It was during one such surge, when the Bastion's guns were faltering and the air had taken on the stench of rot, that the Death Guard arrived in force. Plague Marines advanced without haste, their bolters methodically tearing through firing slits and barricades alike. Behind them rolled the grotesque bulks of their demon engines, belching spores and foul smokes that left men gasping even within sealed rebreathers. Bastion 16 might have been taken in that first push, had the line not erupted into a sudden, impossible counterstroke. From the north came the scream of jet bikes and the thunder of grav engines, Jagatai Khan and his white scars cutting through the Death Guard's flank with the force of a monsoon wind. Katsuhiro saw them only in glimpses, white and red plates streaked with gore, curved blades scything through plague-ridden flesh, the Warhawk himself a streak of lightning among his Keshig. In their wake, the air seemed almost clean again, the Bastion's guns roaring with renewed purpose. When the din faded, the walls still stood, and so did Katsuhiro. His laser gun was pitted from heat stress, his flak torn and stained, his hands trembling. Miz and Doromek were there too, their faces unreadable in the half-light of the Bastion corridors. No one spoke of how close they had come to breaking. The reprieve was brief. The Death Guard would come again, and the air already carried the promise of rot. The days after the Khan's counterattack felt stretched thin, as if time itself had been pulled taut over the Bastion's walls. In that unnatural stillness, Katsuhiro learned the peculiar rhythm of a siege, how the quiet was not peace, but the inhalation before the next strike. The air tasted of oil and antiseptic, layered over the faint metallic sweetness that crept in whenever the wind shifted from the corpse fields. Patrols along the inner corridors were meant to keep the men sharp, but they bred other things, overheard mutterings, glances that lingered too long, the sense that not every man behind the wall was committed to the same cause. It was during one such patrol that a trooper, older, with the stiffness of a man who had served before, leaned to Katsuhiro and whispered his suspicion. Miz and Doromek, he said, had been seen speaking with figures out beyond the ration lines, too far from the assigned sectors. Their movements, he claimed, did not match any duty roster. The words lodged in Katsuhiro's mind like a splinter. In the days that followed, he found himself watching them. Small things at first, a shared glance when orders were given. Their habit of slipping away during the confusion after an assault. Yet no proof came. Then one morning, the man who had spoken his suspicions was found dead in his bunk, eyes open and throat neatly cut. The sergeants wrote it off as a traitor saboteur's work, but Katsuhiro could not shake the image. It was in the wake of that death that the next major push came. The Death Guard advanced with a grim patience, bringing up plague towers whose rusted flanks oozed filth in rivers. Their guns battered Bastion 16 until chunks of ferrocrete fell away like shale, and the defenders fell back from one ruinous barricade to the next. Somewhere in the chaos, Katsuhiro became separated from his squad, driven down a narrow maintenance stair into the understructure. There, in the choking dark, he heard voices. Miz and Doromek, speaking in low tones with two others whose accents were alien to the Pan-Pacific. The words that carried to him were enough. Charges set. Collapse the bastion. Exfiltrate in the confusion. A dull, leaden certainty gripped him. Alpha Legion operatives, using the siege's chaos to unmake the defenses from within. He did not challenge them. Instead, he slipped back along the tunnel, each footfall placed with care. Above, the bastion shuddered under another impact. He was certain that he would not live to escape the underlevels, until the roar of bolters and the crash of armoured boots filled the passage ahead. Sanguinius himself led the counterattack from the Helios Gate, his golden form cutting through the murk like a shard of sunlight driven into the heart of decay. Around him, the Blood Angels tore through the Death Guard lines, their crimson armour gleaming even in the choking gloom. In the confusion, Katsuhiro emerged into the open air, half dragged by a fellow survivor toward the breach being held by the Angels' warriors. Inside the palace walls, the press of wounded and displaced defenders was overwhelming. Medicae teams moved among them, marking the living and the dead with quick swipes of coloured dye. As Katsuhiro slumped against a bulkhead, his gaze caught Doromek in the throng, slipping away, eyes fixed ahead, ignoring the ruin behind him. Katsuhiro forced himself upright, shouting the word, traitor, until his voice broke. The Medicae attending him frowned, murmured something about fever and exhaustion, and drove a sedative into his arm. The world blurred, the Angel's light fading into darkness. When he woke, Bastion 16 was gone, and the war had moved inward. The Palatine Arc was a curve of the inner wall, where the palace's grandeur had already begun to give way to necessity. Once, its promenades had been lined with statuary and cloistered gardens. By the time Katsuhiro was sent there, it had been stripped to bare ferrocrete and gun emplacements, the air thick with a sweet, sickly reek that no incense could mask. The men called it Poxville. Even the Vox traffic used the name without irony. The Death Guard's plague batteries had found their range here early. Shells burst with a wet percussion, scattering not shrapnel, but clotted, diseased matter. Spores clung to surfaces, worked their way into seals, and crept into lungs when filters failed. The defenders wore their rebreathers constantly, the lenses clouded from the inside, their voices rasping through static. No one passed through the Palatine Arc without being changed by it, either by the sickness or by the knowledge of what the sickness could do. Katsuhiro's detachment was folded into the remnants of other battered companies. There was no pretense of command beyond the handful of surviving sergeants. Orders were short, clipped, and almost always some form of hold. It was here that Euphrati Keeler came, moving along the barricades like a vision in the midst of pestilence. Some called her saint before she spoke a word. Others whispered that her presence was proof of the Emperor's hand upon the wall. Katsuhiro saw her only once up close, during an assault when traitor infantry had breached the forward trench and fighting had broken into the barricade lines. She stepped from the smoke, her eyes alight with a force that made even the corrupted recoil. Her voice carried above the din, not in command but in conviction, calling the defenders to stand, invoking the throne's light against the rot pressing in. He felt something kindle in him then, not the brittle stubbornness that had kept him alive so far, but something steadier, harder to extinguish. In the days that followed, he found himself speaking to the other troopers in the long, sleepless hours between bombardments. The words he used were not ones he had thought of before, but they came easily, about the Emperor's will, about the palace as the heart of all mankind, about the necessity of their stand. Men listened. Some repeated those words to others. Soon there were knots of defenders who fought not for rations, not for the empty promise of survival, but with a kind of fervour that made the line hold when it should have broken. The Palatine Arc was not without its champions from the legions. Baron of the Blood Angels commanded one sector, his presence a scarlet anchor amid the grey and sickened ruin. In one battle, when the traitors broke through the outer barricades in a tide of screaming, diseased flesh, It was Baron who met them head-on, his blade carving space for the defenders to reform. Katsuhiro was there when Baron fell, struck by a corrupted blade that seared through armor and bone alike. The officer's final act was to seize Katsuhiro's arm and pull him close, his voice ragged through a helm filter clogged with blood. "Hold the line," he said, "at all costs." There was no ceremony to the transfer of command, only the unspoken reality that every officer above Katsuhiro was now dead. When the enemy's assault faltered, Katsuhiro remained in place at the barricade, shouting orders over the fire, directing the few functioning heavy weapons, organizing the wounded into fire teams. Men obeyed. They did not ask for his commission. In Poxville, survival was proof enough of authority. The Palatine Ark held, but its name was earned anew every day. The plague never stopped seeking a way in, and the Death Guard never stopped watching for the moment it might breach again. The Marmax Bastion stood where the Palatine Ark bent inward toward the higher walls, its guns commanding a long field of rubble where whole hab blocks had once clung to the palace's shadow. Here the fighting was less a matter of sweeping assaults and more an endless grind of position against position. Every gain was measured in meters and often lost again by nightfall. Katsuhiro arrived at Marmax with a handful of men from the Ark, those still fit to walk and hold a weapon. The Bastion's defenders were a mixture of battered Imperial army remnants, palace guard, and citizens' levies who had endured the siege since the first shells struck Terra. They recognized in Katsuhiro the hardened set of someone who had outlasted both enemy and plague, and they deferred to him without question. The enemy's pressure here was constant, probing advances by traitor infantry, sudden surges backed by corrupted armor, and the ever-present arc of artillery fire that fell in steady rhythm. The Death Guard's plague shells were less common in this sector. Instead, the foe favored brute force, as if to grind the bastion down by sheer weight. Each attack came with the heavy tramp of corrupted boots and the grinding roar of machines warped by the warp's will. It was during one such surge that the bastion's southern wall buckled. Katsuhiro and his militia fought in the breach, laser guns burning white in the dust, bayonets flashing in the half-light. It was then that Baron's name returned. Not in person, for the Blood Angel lay buried in Poxville, but in the form of another scion of Sanguinius. A junior officer of the 9th Legion, his armor dulled by ash but his eyes sharp, threw himself into the gap, his blade a line of crimson through the oncoming ranks. The enemy broke against that stand, but the cost was severe. The Blood Angel fell before the breach was fully sealed, his lifeblood pooling on the stone. In his final moments, he looked to Katsuhiro, recognition in his gaze, and gave a single nod. The unspoken weight of command passed again, and Katsuhiro took it without hesitation. In the hours that followed, he moved along the wall, directing fields of fire, shifting squads to reinforce weak points, and ordering the scavenging of weapons from the dead. His men fought with the grim patience he had seen in the White Scar's ranks, striking hard when the moment came, then fading back into cover before the enemy could rally. The bastion did not fall. In the quiet that followed the assault, a disturbance came from the northern wall. Shiban Khan of the White Scars rode in along the parapet, his white armor streaked with soot, cradling in one arm a swaddled infant. Behind him came the dying Lieutenant Cole of the Imperial Army, bloodied but still upright. The sight was a strange one, even in the chaos of siege, and men stepped back to let the Khan pass. Katsuhiro could not know then that the child would remain in his care, nor that its presence would bind him to events beyond the Marmax wall. But in that moment, as the Khan passed the child into waiting arms and rode on, the war seemed to tilt slightly, its weight shifting towards something more than mere survival. The Marmax Bastion would hold for many more days, and each of them would draw Katsuhiro further from the man who had once counted harvest yields in the quiet domes of Hokkaido. The night after Shiban Khan's arrival was one of rare stillness. The enemy's guns did not fall silent, but their fire was desultory, more harassment than assault. In the bastion's upper chambers, Katsuhiro sat with the child swaddled in rough wool, its faint breath a fragile counterpoint to the distant thud of artillery. The infant had been found in a ruin beyond the wall, abandoned amid rubble and smoke. No one knew its lineage, nor how it had survived the killing fields. Katsuhiro had no experience with children. His life until the siege had been all ledgers and harvest quotas, the work of measuring yield and loss in abstract numbers. Yet in the days after the Khan placed the child in his care, he found himself watching it between watches on the wall, noting its small, unconscious movements, the way it clenched its fists when the bombardment drew too close. There was something grounding in the act of keeping it safe, a purpose alongside the defense of stone and steel. The militias he led began to notice. Some treated the child as an omen, a symbol that the throne had not abandoned them. Others, perhaps recalling families they had left behind in the hives or the outlands, fought with a fiercer resolve when they saw the bundle in Katsuhiro's arms. The stories spread quickly. Tales of the foundling at Marmax, protected by a commander who had risen from the ranks through sheer endurance. It was in this time that Garviel Loken appeared at the bastion. The lunar wolf moved through the battered halls in search of Euphrati Keeler, his presence a reminder that beyond each wall and trench, the siege was a vast, shifting theatre in which countless struggles unfolded. Loken spoke with Katsuhiro briefly, his questions measured, his gaze lingering on the child. The two men shared no oaths, no formal pledges, yet there was an unspoken understanding in that exchange. Each was safeguarding something the enemy could not be allowed to touch. Under Katsuhiro's direction, the militias took on a more organized shape. Patrols became disciplined. Ammunition was counted and redistributed with the care of an administratum quartermaster. In the lean hours, he spoke to them as he had in Poxville, of the Emperor's will, of Terra as the fulcrum of all mankind's hope. The words carried weight now, reinforced by the example of the man who stood in the same mud and blood they did, who had no greater armor than their own. The Death Guard did not relent. Their probing attacks at Marmax grew more frequent, sometimes breaking into vicious close quarters, fighting along the wall's outer walkways. Katsuhiro fought in every breach, the child always left in the care of one or two trusted men, never out of reach for long. His faith hardened in these days, less the untested belief of a layman, and more the tempered steel of one who had seen the enemy's face and refused to yield. By the time the order came to abandon the Marmax sector, the militias no longer needed to be told where to go or how to hold. They moved as one, retreating in good order toward the deeper fortifications, the child carried close. Behind them, the bastion's guns were set to overload, denying the enemy any trophy. The Khan had long since vanished into the broader war, but his passage had left its mark. The infant remained. So did Katsuhiro, and the road ahead would lead deeper still into the palace's heart, toward a place that even the enemy hesitated to tread. The order to fall back from the outer bastions carried Katsuhiro and his surviving militia into the labyrinthine heart of the Imperial Palace. The great gates of the Sanctum Imperialis loomed above them, like the ribs of some impossible beast, every span carved and inlaid in ages, when artisans had worked for decades on a single panel. Yet there was no time to take in its grandeur. Refugees from shattered sectors poured through in a crush of bodies, soldiers without regiments, civilians stripped of homes, medici bearing the wounded. The air was thick with the mingled scents of oil, blood, and incense, an overwhelming tide of humanity retreating ever inward. It was among these displaced thousands that Euphrati Keeler reappeared, moving with a calm that parted the press around her. The child in Katsuhiro's arms stirred as she passed, and he found himself stepping into her path without conscious thought. Keeler's gaze fell upon the bundle, and for a heartbeat the cacophony of the retreat seemed to recede. She said nothing of the infant's fate, offered no prophecy or promise, only the smallest nod, as though acknowledging a trust already being kept. Not long after, the exodus began. Keeler and a small company of followers, drawn from every strata of the palace's defense, set out through the inner corridors with purpose. The route they took was not marked on any map Katsuhiro had seen, winding through disused serviceways, archivum vaults where dust lay centuries deep, and narrow stairs that plunged into the bowels of the mountain itself. Always, there was the sense of being guided, sometimes by Keeler's sure step, sometimes by a pale light glimpse just beyond the next turn. Behind them, the siege pressed ever closer. Vox reports told of the Death Guard pushing through sectors once thought impregnable, their plague engines belching ruin into chambers that had not seen battle in 1,000 years. Once, deep in the underways, the sound of bolter fire rolled through the stone, closer than any of them liked. Men gripped their weapons tighter, their eyes darting into the dark. Katsuhiro shifted the infant against his shoulder, feeling its heartbeat quick and steady. The path led at last to a cavernous space unlike any other in the palace's depths, the hollow mountain. Here the air was cold and still, the walls lost in shadow. Those who had made the journey collapsed where they stood, too weary to question their surroundings. Katsuhiro remained on his feet, scanning the dark. When the Death Guard struck, it was without warning, their corrupted forms spilling into the cavern from unseen breaches. The defenders rallied on instinct. Keeler's voice rose over the chaos, carrying a conviction that cut through the enemy's miasma. Somewhere in the melee, Katsuhiro found himself beside a hooded figure whose movements were deliberate, precise. When the clash broke for a moment, the stranger turned to him, and Katsuhiro realized he was speaking to the Lord Cypher. The enigmatic warrior's words were few, but he asked what fear gripped the refugees most. Katsuhiro's answer was plain, that the enemy's advance would find them here before they could move again. Cypher gave no reply, only a slight inclination of the head before melting back into the fray. The attack did not break them. The hollow mountain held, for that night at least, and in its shadowed vaults, the survivors took what rest they could. Katsuhiro kept his vigil with the child beside him, knowing that the journey was not yet done. The light that had led them here would lead them further still, though to where, no one could say. When the guns fell silent, it was not with the clarity of victory, but with the slow fading of a storm that had spent itself. The siege was over, though the palace still shuddered with the weight of its scars. Katsuhiro emerged from the hollow mountain into a world where the air was no longer thick with cordite and plague spore, yet the horizon was a wall of smoke and the sky a dull, unbroken grey. The refugees were herded into camps on the palace's periphery, makeshift grids of prefabricated habs and canvas shelters. Here, the Imperial Army's survivors queued for ration chits alongside civilians, their weapons surrendered, their uniforms little more than rags of flak and insignia. The child never left Katsuhiro's side. Its presence drew questions, but none pressed for answers. In the camp, every soul carried their own burdens, and the foundling was his alone to bear. Life in the camp was a different kind of siege, one of monotony, scarcity, and the constant ache of wounds both visible and hidden. The men who had fought under Katsuhiro's ad hoc command drifted away into other duties, or disappeared into the anonymous tide of the displaced. He spent his days keeping the infant fed, his nights walking the camp's boundaries, half expecting to see some remnant of the enemy in the shadows. It was Shiban Khan who broke the stasis. The Warhawk's arrival in the camp was unannounced, his presence as sudden as a wind off the steppes. He sought Katsuhiro directly, speaking little of the war now past. With him was a woman named Elantra Katamana, her bearing that of one who had navigated the machinery of the Imperium's courts and come away unbroken. Khan explained briefly, as was his way, that arrangements had been made for Katsuhiro, the child, and Elantra to travel eastward to the dragon nations where Katsuhiro had been born. The journey from the camp to the waiting transport passed in a blur. The battered spires of the palace receded into the haze, and the scarred plains of Terra spread out beneath the transport's flight. Below lay cities half in ruin, rivers choked with debris, forests blackened by fire. Yet there were signs of life too, columns of labourers clearing wreckage, shrine banners raised over newly consecrated ground, the first tentative lines of cultivation returning to the soil. When they reached the Dragon Nations, the air was different. The spires here bore the old architectural flourishes of the Pan-Pacific, lacquered and inlaid rather than clad in plain steel. The war had touched this place lightly compared to the palace's shadow. though the people bore the same guarded expressions as any who had lived through the siege. Katsuhiro stepped onto the soil of his birth carrying the child, the ledger of his old life now irrevocably closed. There was no ceremony, no final muster. Only the quiet truth that he had survived where so many had not, and that the Emperor's war, though distant now, would never truly be over. The seasons in the Dragon Nations passed differently than in the shadow of the Imperial Palace. The air held the scent of salt from the eastern seas, and the winds carried the hum of cicadas across tiered rice paddies that shimmered under the sun. To the people here, Katsuhiro was a returned son, though one they had never known well. His youth among the terraces of Hokkaidan Hive marked him as their own, but the lines in his face and the measured way he moved told of another world entirely, a world of walls under siege and skies filled with fire. He worked the land again, at first awkwardly, as if his hands had forgotten the feel of tools that were not forged for killing. Yet in time, the rhythm returned. Each planting season layered new life over the memories of shattered bastions and plague-choked air. The child, now walking, followed him among the paddies, asking questions that had no place in the war he had lived. Katsuhiro answered as he could, shaping the truth into something the boy could carry without fear. But war was never absent. Couriers from the administratum came with news of far-off campaigns, lists of tithes, and calls for conscription in regions the enemy still harried. Pilgrims arrived from other nations, some seeking the shrines raised to the siege's martyrs, others carrying the imperial cult's teachings to the smallest villages. Katsuhiro listened to their tales in the evenings, his gaze often drifting to the horizon where the sun bled into the sea. The blade he had carried in the siege, standard issue, chipped and worn, remained in his home, cleaned and wrapped in oilcloth. It was not displayed, nor hidden, but kept where his hand could find it should the need arise. Beside it lay a small battered ledger from his days as an enumerator, the final page unfinished, the ink line broken. These were his relics, one from a life before the war, one from the crucible in which that life had been remade. Some nights, when the boy slept and the village lay quiet, Katsuhiro would light a single candle and set both items before him. He would trace the edge of the blade with his thumb, then rest his hand on the ledger, feeling the weight of both. One was the measure of all that had been lost, the other, the means by which something had been preserved. He knew the Imperium would always demand more soldiers, more grain, more faith. And he knew, should that demand reach his village, he would answer. The ledger and the blade would go with him. For the Emperor's wars were unending, and a man who had once held the line at Bastion 16 did not lay down his duty until the throne itself fell silent.